I was lost. I was looking over there.
Well, let's try out this new configuration.
With your leave, we will swap in a redacted Exhibit 50 for the unredacted one, because I didn't really get into anything beyond the mandate on page 3 or 4. So if we can do that,
Redacted version of which exhibit?
the perspectives report redacted for all the Boaker and Stark
Oh,
revisions could be a replacement Exhibit 50.
50.
I think that's what it was, 50?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Correct.
Yes, it is.
And then
Very nice.
I don't intend to ask any more questions about that report myself. I would move then to just demands. And which was 49, was it?
Will somebody be asking questions on this report?
Somebody will, indeed.
I don't have a screen. Oh,
So we need the beginning of the demonstratives.
thank you.
Chapter 1 background.
Exhibit P.
Oh, that's right, it's P.
And I forgot to ask, but Mr. Schachter, you were the one in that conversation with respect to the redactions. You're content with this
Yeah.
replacement?
They have redrafted what they want to redact. Appears to be what the response to Paul Hacker and Stars.
Mhm.
I haven't read it in detail, but it is what it is, and that's fine.
Okay, thank you. When you're ready.
Thank you. Dr. Von Granite, let's begin with chapter 1 now. You gave us an overview of what's in the various chapters. And now let's kind of drill down and get into it in some more detail. I'm going to begin at slide 3. And you talk there about two different ways or two different models that were used in terms of compensation for extinguishment of what is in quotation marks here as Indian title. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then let's just begin with an expansion or explanation of the lump sum payment method, if you would.
Yeah, so what I did is I just provided an introductory background or reminder of how the extinguishment of what was called Indian title worked prior to the Robinson treaties. And as you may recall, of course, the first treaties were done using a lump sum system where the First Nations was just received a single sum. The example I gave was the 1806 surrender to the Mississauga of their lands in what is now Mississauga for consideration of £1,000. And so these were just single one-time payments. They had no annuity provisions at all. And so they really provided no benefit to the First Nation beyond the year in which they were paid, which was the treaty year.
Sir, is there some, you have called them the first treaties or prior treaties, sometimes the Upper Canada treaties. Is it fair to give them one of those names consistently? Would that help?
Sure, we could call them the pre-1850 treaties.
Great, thank you.
Although those treaties themselves have points of differentiation, do they not?
Yes,
Like you're talking about a model right now, as I understand you, it has no population component to it.
that's correct. Yeah, so
Whereas later,
yes, so the lump sum payments were just settled on as a figure without any population consideration. But that changed as of 1818, when they started a process of doing these treaties with annuity distributions.
So you're now moving into this slide number 4, the next slide,
Yes,
and your discussion of the population-based model of compensation.
right.
Okay, let's go through that then.
Yeah, so beginning in 1818 and then continuing from that time, the large tracts that were surrendered throughout Upper Canada from time to time all worked on this model of providing them with an annuity. And the annuity was just a function. First of all, it wasn't a function at all of the size of the lands. That was not a consideration at all. It wasn't neither was the value of the lands, if there was any, or if it could be calculated. Rather, the compensation was a function of a formula. The formula was just simply the time of treaty population multiplied by 2 pounds, 10 shillings, which converts to an even $10. And so sometimes these treaties would have it would stipulate the amount, which was the product of that calculation, or it would stipulate what the per capita payment was, or it would stipulate both. In some cases, you'd have to do the math yourself. In other cases, there was no real rule of thumb as to how that particular formula was applied to these treaties.
So the treaty compensation was expressed in one of 2 ways. Either
Yeah, in several ways.
either the product of time of treaty population times 2.10 or 2.10 times the population.
Sometimes it would just be the total compensation, and they would provide a population figure separately, and then you would have to do the math.
Okay.
And when you do the math, it turns out to be $10. Right. So, and there's at least one case in which, because it may have been unclear, they went on to specify on a separate piece of paper that it was in fact $10. Right. So, no matter how it was actually written into the text of the treaty itself, the calculations at the end of the day always amounted to $10 per capita
At the time.
at the time, given the population at the time of treaty.
So as you note then, if the population increased, you say in bullet 3, if the population increased, the per capita share would decrease.
Yes,
You have that at the end of,
Absolutely.
at the end of your 3rd
yeah,
bullet.
because the calculation was done at the time of treaty, and that amount, whatever it was the total amount of the perpetual annuity as long as the sun shines and the rivers flow. And the government always then had a predictable amount that they'd have to set aside every year,
Mhm.
irrespective of the population.
So we're talking about annuities now,
Yes,
beginning in 1818
Yes.
and continuing. And you said compensation was based on the annuity part of the compensation.
yeah, generally the annuity was the compensation. There were, I believe there were times there may have been a down payment as well. But the annuity was what was the annual obligation to the crown. And so it was a set amount, so much so that this set amount continued to be paid without increase or decrease every single year, year after year, for decades and decades, until it was eventually capitalized in 1869. And I'll explain that a little later, what that total figure was. For the Crown, it made no difference what the population was. Their annuity funds that were devoted to that particular First Nations would remain the same every year. And was administered as an annuity fund.
So your annuity obligation didn't change.
No, the annuity obligation didn't change. So there was what's called an annuity fund that was set aside to use to pay for these treaties. And this annuity fund remained the same, never changed. It was always 26,000 and change every single year.
So only, probably messed this up, but only what they call the divisor changed. Is that if you divide 10 by 5, 5 is called the divisor, is it? Anyway, that's the variable. The population changed, but the financial exposure of the
Yes.
government never changes, what you're saying.
That's correct.
Right.
So now some of these treaties had provisions for diminutions as opposed to augmentations. They never had an augmentation, but they have provisions for diminutions. And these were usually, they varied from treaty to treaty. And what it was is basically, if your population decreased to a certain threshold, at that point, you would no longer get that full amount that was cited in the treaty. It was then proportionately reduced.
What number in the multiplication was reduced?
The total annuity.
So they didn't care about what the number was. They just took a total.
Yes, the total annuity would be reduced in proportion. The treaty might say, for example, that if your population reaches 2/3, then you only get 2/3 of the amount, right? But if it's above 2/3, then you still get the full amount.
Right. If it's above 2/3, you don't benefit. If it's below 2/3, there will be a diminution.
Yes, and so I think the idea behind that was theoretically a First Nation could be reduced in population to the point where they would be getting far more per capita than $10.
Well, I wanted to ask you that if now is the time, Mr. Marcelo, throughout your report, you repeat this line. The population increased, the per capita share of the annuity would decrease.
Yes,
That is based on an assumption that the annuity was always paid per capita.
no, you would have a lump, you would get a lump sum in your annuity fund,
Yeah.
right? And if let's say the population increased, the per capita share would decrease. Now the First
But
Nation.
I specifically asked you if this assertion of yours is based on an assumption that the annuity is paid out per capita. Because if it's
No.
not paid, per capita, then it doesn't matter what the per capita share is. Then you're only talking about the amount of the annuity.
Yes,
The amount of the annuity doesn't change.
that's correct. The amount of the annuity doesn't change, but if the population decreases, then or I should say, if the population increases, then the amount that was available to individuals would decrease.
That's based on an assumption that there's an amount going to individuals.
Well, it's not going to individuals, right?
Well, that's what I'm
true.
asking you.
Yes,
So if there's $100, let's
Yeah.
say it's based on 10 people in the band
right.
and it's a $10 annuity,
Yes,
you got $100.
yes,
And the next year, but it's not handed out to them. They're putting it in the bank or they're buying farm implements for
Right.
everyone to share.
that's right.
If the population goes to 11
Yes,
or 12,
yes,
it's still $100.
yes,
And this notion of that you, as I say, you repeat, the per capita share decreases. nothing decreases. The number, except this notion that which is a foundational notion of the calculation, that decreases, but nobody's making a calculation in year 2 or year 3 or year 4 as the population increases. They're not
Right,
making a calculation. They're just paying $100. So what the band
That's
gets
right.
is $100.
yes, the band gets $100. Now, where it starts making a difference is in the later treaties where you apply the
Right,
same.
I'm just working
yeah.
with what you've got here.
Yeah, okay, so in the pre-1850 treaties, as I said, the original calculation was done on a per capita basis. So and in some treaties, it was stipulated that they would be getting $10 per capita. That's how it was actually stated.
Right.
And the only point I'm making is that effectively, what an increase in population meant is that they would be getting less.
Well, I just
Right.
wanted,
It's not that
I
they're
don't
in-
want to conflate. I
Right.
don't, for myself,
Okay,
a formula for the purpose of calculation
yes,
and whether it has anything to do with how it's distributed,
gotcha.
because they're not connected, are they? They're
Well,
not, they're not necessarily connected.
I think for the First Nations, they would see them as connected because they are obviously, they had the understanding that they would be getting $10 per capita, but over time, their band is still getting the same amount, but it's not as sufficient for their needs as it should have been because
Okay,
you know, they're getting for the per capita, they're only getting, you know, $8 or whatever, right?
this is the confusion I'd like to avoid. You say the First Nations thought they were getting it per capita,
Well,
but they're not necessarily, that's what I asked you, the method of calculation does not necessarily is not necessarily connected with the method of distribution.
right,
So the First Nations may have thought that the value would always be based on that calculation.
yes,
But I believe what you're saying is, but the agreement was, it was based on time of treaty population.
that's correct,
I think I got it.
yes. But it's not, I mean, I would disagree that it should be characterized as an assumption. It's a fact that the per capita distribution or the per capita amount is less.
Mm.
Right,
I'll leave that with you.
yeah. So,
$100 is $100 to me. Whether I got 6 kids to feed or 20 kids to feed, all I got is $100.
that's right, but each kid might get a lot less than.
Sorry, point of clarification. We've now introduced a new topic called pre-capita as opposed to per capita. And I wonder
Oh.
if there's a difference.
I didn't even hear that.
If that was my introduction, I'm
Probably
sorry. If
just
that
as-
was the witness.
No, no, it was
He's
the
sorry.
witnesses. It was the
Oh,
witnesses.
then he's sorry.
There's no such thing here. is there?
No, I'm hoping it's a slip of the tongue, but if it's not, we should find out what it is.
Okay, but I don't want to go further. I think I just wanted to clear up any confusion that I might have listening to you and just highlight for you where I would need clarity.
Fair enough.
Okay,
I'm sorry, so there is no pre-capita.
I've never,
Okay, all right, thank you.
pre-treaty population. There you go. Okay, sorry, Mr. Marcel, please go ahead.
That's quite all right. All right, so I think we probably more than covered slide 4. And you move in slide 5, you move into a discussion, Doctor, of source of the money, right?
yes,
Now into where's the money coming from? And throughout your evidence here, there's this, if I may, tell me if I'm wrong, but there's this kind of watershed point about whether money's actually directly referable to proceeds from resources or whether it's coming from, government apportionments of one sort or another. This is kind of a theme that seems to run through this part of your evidence. Do you follow what I mean?
Yes.
And so why don't you talk about where the money came from? And let's stay on slide 5 for now, because it certainly gets, all of it gets complicated.
Yeah, it does get it confusing because, originally these annuity funds, and that's what they're called consistently throughout, they were originally drawn from these British parliamentary grants. This was before, of course, the Indian Department was under civil administration and became part of the province of Canada. So there's these grants that were financing Indian affairs in both the Canadas, and the funds were then repaid each half year into the military chest, which and those funds were derived from what was called the territorial revenue of the province, which was any and all revenues that came from the territory. And then once you had the United Province of Canada, which was in 1840, there was an Indian annuity fund eventually established. At first, there was no provision made for payments of annuities at all, even though these were like a permanent charge. But then there was this annuity fund that was established, and this was controlled by the Receiver General. And so that at that point, these annual fixed sums were to be paid from the general territorial revenue, but were not traceable to any proceeds from the lands. So after that, well, in the course of doing that, the distributions themselves from these annuity funds were used or were made on the authority of the Indian Department, which itself was under the Governor General's auspices. And it was based on requisitions from chiefs. So that a chief and together with an Indian agent would decide, how much money they needed that year for a particular purpose. And then there'd be some kind of warrant issued to get these funds from the account. And then if there's any money left over, it was invested by the Receiver General to benefit the band. So it wasn't always the case that every year, as soon as the annuity fund came in, it was immediately taken out for a purpose. So often little amounts that were left over. So I went through all of the books from these early years, I went through all of the account books to see how these monies actually flowed and how they were put into various accounts for the various First Nations. And it was quite an illuminating project, of the details of which I give in my report. So then we get to, I suppose, the next slide, which is the source of the annuity funds, a continued discussion of them. Now, there was in 1846 a statute, and I don't pretend to know, the legal language to it, but it was referred to as the civil list. And under this statute, all territorial and other revenue over which the province had any control or power of appropriation formed this single consolidated revenue fund. So you had the single pile of money somewhere, which I refer to as the CRF, the Consolidated Revenue Fund. And it's an important fund because it's the one that funded all of the annuities from then on. So that fund was used to defray expenses all expenses, including the annuities, under all the treaties. And that fund is, back in those days, had an interesting composition because it really had, there was actually very little that came from the land. Unlike in the United States, where the lands contributed a huge amount to the general funds of the country. Here in what was in Upper Canada, actually very little. Most of the CRF came from duties and excise taxes. There's only a fraction that came from land sales. And of course, because it's a consolidated fund, there was no traceable link at all between it and any of the proceeds from lands, if there were any, under those, in the territories of those treaties. And as I said earlier, Your Honor, there is this figure that we see over and over and over and over again. It continues all the way up to 1869, the same amount. $26,620. That is the amount, the total amount of the Crown commitment and their obligation under all the under all the pre-1850 treaties combined was $26,620.
As a
every year.
capitalized figure,
No,
as an annual.
as an annual
Annual
figure. Every single year, that amount had to be appropriated from the CRF. And that was an amount that couldn't change, in part because of this 1846 statute creating the civil list, because that amount is actually stated in that statute, although there was a misprint. Instead of 6,655 pounds, the statute actually said it was 6,666. And so when I looked at it, it took me a couple of days to figure out what was going on because the numbers never matched. And I eventually figured out that what probably happened was whoever wrote the statute read 2 6s instead of 2 5s. In those days, things were always done by hand first before they were printed. And it's easy to see how 2 5s can become 2 6s.
So we have a little graphic on slide 7. I wonder if you could tell me what I think is obvious. These treaties here are mentioned here, or what's called quotes tribes. They're referable to 1850 or earlier treaties. Is that right?
Yes, these are this is the list of the pre 1850 treaties in Upper Canada, which had annuity provisions.
And can you just walk us through this? So what I would like, Her Honor may as well have some specific requests. What I would like you to do for us is take us through the rows and the columns and just elucidate whether the again, in quotes, the tribe is Anishinaabe or exactly what
Right.
and explain the arithmetic if you're able to do that. And that's what I would ask you to do.
Yeah, so here what we have is a statement that was produced on June 21st, 1851 by the Receiver General's office. And it basically just outlines, of course, June 1851, keep in mind that this is just months before the first annuities are due under the Robinson treaties. So it doesn't include the Robinson treaties. I selected this particular one because it was the one that was immediately preceding the Robinson obligations. So this is what was in place at the time. And what you see here are what they referred to as tribes, but which of course are the First Nations who had these treaties. And when you see anything that says Chippewas, which is the first three, or Mississaugas, which is also listed there, Mississaugas of the Credit and the Mississaugas of Alnwick. As I said earlier, the Mississaugas had a lump sum payment in one of their treaties, but they also had another treaty later on that had annuities. So they also had annuities. And then, of course, the Saugeenes, they're also Anishinaabe. So most of these are Anishinaabe. In fact, the only exception here are the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and the Moravians of the Thames. And where it says proportion due each, those are the actual annuities payable every single year. And then the total is 6655, which in this instance is correct. Although it doesn't match the civil list number, it's off by 11. And then in the first column, those are not the population numbers at the time of treaty, rather they are the latest population numbers available, which was 1848. And if you did the math, you'd see that obviously multiplying those by $10 is not going to give you the same numbers.
So the formula doesn't work anymore.
The formula is only relevant for the establishment of the annual figure that they get.
Thank you.
So I think that's about all I can say about that. There you see that figure is again a 6655, a very important figure, which
Is that the 26,620,
yes,
only in pounds?
yes. So the government, I mean, the advantage to this system for the Crown was that it was completely predictable. Every year, you knew exactly how much money you needed to set aside for this purpose. There were no fluctuations. It didn't matter how much the lands brought in, or it didn't matter if the lands brought in nothing. For the First Nations, the advantage was that if the lands had brought in no proceeds at all, they'd still be guaranteed this figure. And I think that was the reasoning behind it, whatever we may think about it today. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the territories of these various First Nations varied considerably in size. They were all very large. They're in the hundreds of thousands or millions of acres. They're big chunks of land, but there's no relationship whatsoever between the sizes of the lands that were ceded and the amounts that they got annually, because it was a population-based system.
Your Honor?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Can we move then to the next slide? And you engage here in a discussion of the treatment of large tracts of land, smaller parcels of land, such as portions of reserves. And I think you're kind of drawing some distinctions between how these types of land were handled as opposed to larger pieces of land that were surrendered. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you then explain how these other tracts of land worked financially?
Yeah, so there were other types of arrangements, obviously, between the Crown and First Nations, and these usually involve these smaller parcels, in particular portions of reserves that had been set aside under previous treaties. And also in some cases, there were islands involved, or small lots of various descriptions. And these were dealt with not as these kind of treaties, but rather as arrangements that involved the payment of future proceeds. And there were different types. The first big distinction between these and the annuity fund type treaties is that they had no fixed annuities. There are no annuities at all.
With these new arrangements? Do we
Yes.
want to call them something? Sales?
Well, they are arrangements resulting in land funds as opposed to arrangements resulting in annuity funds. Right, so that's the
And we can't call them sales. Land sales.
well, they're not, well, I suppose we could call them land sales.
I actually don't want to put those words in your mouth. If
Yeah,
you- if
I
you
mean-
don't call them that, you call them arrangements that resulted in
In
land
funds.
fund.
Yes, we could call them land sales in the sense that the lands were literally sold or intended to be sold in return for the proceeds from those lands. So the best way to describe it is to give the examples. I mean,
Are we on slide 8?
no,
Yes.
yeah, we're still on slide 8. Yeah, so there's nothing in the instrument actually that stipulates how much we're going to get. Right, so there's no figure, no amount. There's no annuity, no lump sum, none of that. What it is, however, is a promise. The promise is the Crown gets the lands, and the Crown then promises all the future proceeds after the costs, so the net proceeds arising from the sale of those lands to settlers, or a share of those proceeds in defined amounts that are defined in the instrument, or the interest on the proceeds. So those are the three sort of categories of promises, if you will. And so what happened to them then, the lands were then auctioned. So this was usually in like, let's say, a portion of a reserve. A reserve was intended, even though the Crown often thought of the reserve lands as Crown lands, they were for the exclusive use and occupation of the First Nation. And so it's not like a real estate transaction. It's not really sort of the underlying title that's being sold. It's I guess, I don't want to use lawyer speak, but it's kind of a usufructuary kind of right. It's some kind of I mean, there's some debate I hear about, what the actual legal status was of reserve lands, but whatever it was, that was being sold to the Crown. And the Crown would then promise the proceeds from any, and usually those, the language of these instruments was such that it would be to the benefit of the First Nation, or they would be sold to their best advantage. Right? So the idea was is that, unlike the annuity treaties, the government couldn't just simply give the lands away. They had to sell them at some kind of a profit that benefited the First Nation.
You mentioned in the first point, in the first bullet, all future proceeds after costs.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on the after costs?
Well, the instruments themselves, refer to that, right? So it was net. It was not, the government wasn't going to sell these lands and then end up
Paying for the surveys.
yeah,
So
right.
surveys would be.
Yeah, that's right.
Surveys would be one of those
Yeah,
costs.
I
know
mean,
you talked
that
about
would be a cost.
Sorry,
So,
can you just speak one at a
Sorry.
time?
I said surveys would be one of those costs then. And
Yes.
I know you talk about surveys later. Sorry.
yes,
Let's go then to number 9, slide 9, and you had this, the emergence of a compensation model. A unique compensation model, excuse me. What do you mean by that? What's happening here?
well, this is now, when we get into the Robinson, the Robinson treaties basically, here you have a kind of different situation because the population to the north of Lakes Huron and Superior were so high because for whatever reason, they were high. There were many First Nations involved. Some of these earlier treaties, there was only one First Nation involved. Here you've got 17 or more bands, right, in these territories. And so the total population is very high. And so the usual population-based formula, which would provide $10 per capita, would have required an annual commitment. And this is where things get really bizarre. I've never encountered this in any other investigation I've done over the years. It just happens to be the exact figure. I mean, totally coincidental as far as I know, of 6,655 pounds or 26,620. I nearly fell over backwards when I did these calculations. It turned out to be the exact same number. I thought there was something strange going on, but it is what it is. It's one of these quirky things in history where we get the exact same figure. So if you applied that same model to the Robinson treaties, as you had in the pre-1815 treaties, you would have required an annual commitment that was identical to the total of all the other treaties combined. And that for the Crown is a non-starter.
And did you say 18? I just want to check the record. Did you say 1815 or 1850?
I said 1850. Sorry.
50. Okay.
So you may recall, I know this is going back years now, my earlier testimony, Goodall and Anderson have proposed this kind of hybrid in 1849 that anticipated the usual kind of annuity payments, but linked them to proceeds from the ceded lands and then suggested offering a modest annuity based on the funds available, and if necessary, adding a provision that would increase the annuity in the event the new sources of wealth somehow materialized in the future. And you may also recall that same year, Anishinaabe leaders north of Lakes Huron and Superior had an interest in a treaty that would provide them with a perpetual annuity. Some of these chiefs had contemplated a scheme by which the province of Canada would provide them with or direct net proceeds from the disposition of these mining locations to the fund. This would be a capital fund, the annual interest of which would then generate the treaty annuity. There was, you recall, there was, Shinwakons and Nebenogatching who were in the Sault Ste. Marie area who were think they had this view in mind that this would, that the mining proceeds or the interest thereon would provide them with the annuities they were asking for. And of course, when we go to the next slide, Robinson then was,
Slide 10,
I'm sorry?
slide 10.
Yes, on slide 10. Yeah, so I mean, this is all review, basically. Robinson had advised that about 7,500 pounds or $30,000 is available in actual proceeds. He rounded that off to 8,000. Eventually, which is what he offered. But he had been instructed to assume that he had a capital sum which was subsidized from other sources, because obviously 7,500 isn't going to do it. So there was a capital sum that he had been, you may recall that he had, that there was a instructions that was given to him prior to treaty, and he was told that that an amount that was not to exceed that 25,000 pounds, which would have been $100,000, was at his disposal. And if you do the math, this would have yielded a maximum annuity of 1,500 or $6,000, so 1,500 pounds. But this is not the actual amount of the annuity that he had, because he was also told that, you know, he was expected to give a lump sum at the beginning, and you have to subtract that from the capital amount. So as a result, the annuity would be less.
You address it in regard to the excuse me, Robinson Superior Treaty in the middle of the second bullet on slide 10.
Yes.
Can you just tell us the details of that?
Yeah, so when I prepared this slide deck, Your Honor, last week, I tried to narrow it down just to the RST, because I did all of this stuff for the RHT as well, but I thought it best that I'd focus on the RST so we didn't have to repeat it as well for RHT. But in terms of the RST, Robinson ended up offering 4,000 pounds as a down payment and then 1,000 pounds in annuity. And then when this was split into two, the superior version provided for 2,000 pounds and a fixed annuity of 500 pounds to be paid every year. And if you do the math on that for the Lake Superior, that works out to about $1.61 per capita. So it's nowhere near the $10. I mean, it's not even close, right? So this, of course, this whole system that Robinson was instructed, I mean, if you look at Robinson's instructions, it was already postulated that it would be an annuity fund that was based on a capitalization and a fixed annuity that would be paid from such a capitalization. It was already envisioned as a fixed amount that had an upper limit, just like the other treaties, and that wherein population became irrelevant.
What was the upper limit?
Well, I mean, as I said, the fixed annuity was 500, right? I'm not talking about the augmentation clause, which of course is another addition to the whole treaty.
Talking about the $2,000.
Yeah, so the down payment of the 2,000 pounds, the fixed annuity of 500 pounds or $2,000. So this $2,000 would have to be paid every year, no matter what its source. Doesn't matter if the proceeds went up or down or even existed. This would have to be paid every year, just like the pre-1850 treaties.
Well, isn't it more correct to say this base amount would have to be paid every year? And they had to, then there was a promise made. They had to figure that out.
Yes, well, I refer to it as the pre-augmented portion.
Pre-augmented.
Yes,
Got it.
that's the words that I use. So
Okay.
the pre-augmented annuity was 2,000 for the RST.
But if you were the decision maker in the legislature, you had to know that that was not the only, your words just now were, it was envisioned that this was a fixed amount. Not,
Yeah.
not this, not the annuity was a fixed amount, the pre-augmented annuity was a fixed amount.
That's right.
Okay.
So now this differed from a proceeds model that I just described a few minutes ago, in that there was cash paid up front. There was a fixed annuity specified at the time of treaty. And because of that, this, what they had in mind was what the Receiver General called an annuity fund rather than a land fund. And it's important to distinguish these two because they're not as distinctions that I make. They're distinctions that the Crown made in their administration of all the treaties. This was always there on the books. I traced these books over the course of decades, and it's always the same distinction that's made. And I give examples of that in due course. But for now, it's important to keep in mind that what was envisioned here was an annuity fund for the Robinson treaties. And indeed, that's precisely where those monies ended up being paid into and out of, as opposed to a land fund, which is administered quite differently.
Weren't the land funds mostly non-treaty arrangements?
The land funds were primarily based on those other arrangements I talked about earlier.
Call them other arrangements, but they weren't
Yes.
treaties.
Well, they're often listed as treaties in the, the
Oh.
source that we find that Canada, it's
Morris on treaties.
no, not in Morris. Morris only deals with the number treaties, but in that other book was written in the late 19th century called Canada, Indian Treaties and Surrenders. It's a 3-volume set.
Volume 1 is exhibit 12 in phase 1, I believe.
Okay, so it's Canada's treaties and surrenders. They would be in the surrenders part.
There is no devoted section to each type. They're sort of randomly thrown in and numbered.
All right.
Also
Would you ever
to-
call them treaties, these arrangements? That you have talked about
I don't-
arrangements with the result. What did you call them earlier? Arrangements that resulted in payments into the land fund. I asked you for a word
Yes.
and you certainly didn't come up with treaty. So I'm just
Yes.
saying, do you distinguish these from treaties? I'm thinking ahead to what I have to know.
Yes, so I recognize that the term treaty has certain different legal connotations than it does historically. Historically, is loosely used for any kind of arrangements that involved a relationship between the Crown and First Nations. So it's not that I don't want to call them treaties. It's just that if we call all of them treaties, that's fine with me. But we must
Got it.
not neglect the distinction. That there's a crucial distinction between the ones that ended up in the annuity fund system and the ones that end up in the land fund system. And that distinction is quite clear. And it's based on the fact that one has annuities and the other one has promised proceeds.
Okay,
So the entire Robinson treaties were administratively understood by the Crown to be much or no different than the pre-1850 treaties, except that they had a unique addition, and that the fixed annuity was subject to augmentation if further conditions were met. That was the only thing that was really unique about Robinson in
Does-
this historical context.
Doctor, does this then lead us into a discussion of the relevance of tracking, which happens to be the next slide?
Yes. So now, with this kind of hybrid model, the revenues from the lands would have to be tracked, obviously, and compared to costs. But only for the purpose, and again, I'm when I say this, I'm telling you this from the perspective of the 19th century Crown. And keep that in mind. So revenues from the lands would have to be tracked and compared against costs, but only for the purpose of ascertaining whether the condition of the augmentation clause that allowed an increase to $4 per capita had been met.
and I take it, sir, when you say something like this, because in the report, you don't footnote that assertion, that that's an opinion. When you say only for the purpose of,
That is how the Crown understood it.
do you footnote that? When you say that's how they understood it, I looked when I saw that. Is
Yes.
that your conclusion?
It is my conclusion
Okay.
based on the actions of the Crown for half a century.
Okay. That's, that helps me.
So then I mean, and I know this may be somewhat controversial, but so I just provided Robinson's own words in that slide. And in my view, this was consistent with what he was getting at.
This is the quote beginning, "I trust His Excellency."
Yes.
On slide 11.
He saw this, as an immediate and final settlement of the matter, rather than paying the Indians the full amount of all monies on hand and a promise of accounting to them for future sales. That, what he's referring to there is the accounting to them for future sales was the kind of arrangement that led to the land funds. He saw this as an annuity fund type system, but albeit with a unique element that augmented the annuity in the future if certain conditions were met.
Sorry, I only made probably, you mentioned land, fund. He saw it as a land fund. Did you say that?
No, he saw this as an annuity fund system as opposed to a land fund.
I see.
And that is precisely what happened. At no time were the Robinson treaties ever was anything under the Robinson treaties ever paid under a land fund. It was always under an annuity fund.
Tell me what that means with reference to proceeds to the Crown, you mean, I don't want to lead you on this point, but how do proceeds relate to payment, if at all? Are they a marker?
Yeah,
Or are they something else?
Well, as we'll see later, because I go into this in great depth later on. The proceeds from the lands were, there was some disagreement about whether the proceeds from the lands would actually pay for the annuities, or the proceeds from the lands were only relevant to establish whether the threshold under the augmentation clause had been reached. And at that point, the annuity would be increased, but not necessarily from the proceeds of the lands. And this was a matter that was so unclear that it even reached the Supreme Court of Canada in 1895, which ruled on that very question.
And I think you said earlier, I might not have the exact year, but from the 1846, 1847 period, the funding always came from the CRF.
Yes.
We have passed through chapter 1. You gave us an overview earlier of chapter 2, which is entitled Early Efforts to Meet Treaty Obligations. Now we're going to move into that chapter, Your Honor, if that's all right.
Thank you.
And the first aspect of payment that you address here is the distribution of the down payment.
Yes.
Can I actually go back to one thing, please?
Absolutely.
I'm just looking at my notes. So the last thing you said was this matter was so unclear, went to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1895. And the issue which was unclear, if I understand you, was whether the proceeds from the lands, that's what you said, the proceeds from the lands would actually pay for the annuities, or whether they were only relevant to establish the threshold.
Yes.
So you say that was unclear
It was,
or debated.
yeah, I think perhaps a better word is it was debated.
Okay.
It not necessarily unclear, but certainly debated. It
Matters on which reasonable minds disagree.
exactly
Okay.
that was my point.
But earlier you said the only purpose of tracking was to ascertain whether the threshold had been met. And that is and you say that is my conclusion. I asked you whether that was footnote. You said that's a fact. That's my conclusion. But you say it was a matter which was either a subject of debate or so unclear.
Yeah, so it depended on which, well, okay, so let's put it this way. This issue actually didn't come up because proceeds were not used for the payment of the pre-augmented annuities. They came out of the CRF. So at that point, there was no reason for debate. Where it started becoming a matter of dispute was when in 1874, Canada and Ontario began contemplating the issue of augmenting the annuities. And the Premier of Ontario, Mowat, who was also his own Attorney General and quite a lawyer himself, said, no way, the proceeds don't come out of the lands. the government of Canada has to pay this obligation no matter where the money comes from. It's not tied to the land. Whereas Canada eventually took the position that no, Ontario needs to pay because they have access to the proceeds, or they're the jurisdiction that has access to it. So by the time it reached the Supreme Court, it was still a live issue. But until 1874, it was no issue at all. The lands were irrelevant because
Because those who held the view that the money came from the Consolidated Revenue Fund were in charge.
that's right.
And it was only when there was a question of who is the payor.
Yes,
Is that
yes,
right?
yes.
Or is that what you're saying? Okay. Thank you.
So slide 12, let's have you talk about the down payment aspect. What was done to meet that obligation?
All right, so, well, the first obligation obviously was the down payment because that had to be paid right away. And Robinson had already been provided with bags of coins, literally, in kettles, in American $50 denominations. You can imagine the size of that load. It had to come by boat with a special guard and cost a fortune to get to the treaty venue. And so he had it on hand. And so he took over the responsibility of distributing the initial down payment to the Robinson-Huron Treaty beneficiaries. But he did not do it for the RSD because that was done by a Hudson's Bay Company official. So the initial down payment was the first time that the monies were distributed, or any monies were distributed under this treaty. And that was within days of the actual signing of the treaty. And it was done over various locations over the course of several days. And it was accompanied with a series of vouchers. And these vouchers had the lists of the named chiefs and the heads of families, together with Robinson made a breakdown of how many individuals were in each family. And so the money, the coins were physically given to the heads of families, who then it was up to them to do as they pleased with it, whether to, use it themselves or give some to their families or to distribute it in any further way. So by setting up this list or series of vouchers, he had a record. And this record, the intention really was not only to meet the accounting requirements, because Robinson had to make sure that every penny was accounted for. And so he ended up creating this record, which was sort of like the precursor to the pay lists, which we see in the archival record for the next few generations. And that, in fact, was the intention, is to start this process, because he knew that, in addition to the down payment, every year somebody's going to have to come with a list of people and make sure that everybody gets their annuity payment. Although it worked differently as you'll see, in the RHT as opposed to the RST.
Over to the next slide, because this is rather detailed, this process of dealing with the down payment. you continue to explain it here. Would you take us through this?
Yeah, I mean, most of I tried to pare down in these slides, the details as much as possible, because it's a mind-numbing exercise to go through all of this stuff. And so I've tried, this is a skeleton of it, really. So the RST down payment was first vouched for by these 9 signatories to the RST. Right on the same day that the treaty was signed, they vouched for the full amount of the down payment. But the bundle of coins was actually placed in the hands of the Hudson's Bay Company official, John Swanston, who at the time was the chief trader at Michipicoten, the nearest big Hudson's Bay Company post on Lake Superior. And so he took the money and he then ended up distributing it on behalf of the Crown. He was accompanied by the RST Anishinaabe leadership on the same boat. And so they ended up at Michipicoten, and then he distributed the money to all the heads of families who were there, and then retained whatever money was left over, because not everybody's at the post at the same time. It's very rare. In fact, almost never happened that the entire population would be at the post. So you just couldn't do these distributions all at once and in totality. So he retained whatever was left, as particularly for the more remote bands, such as the Pic and the Long Lake First Nations, and who could only attend the next spring anyway. So unlike the RHT, which had eventually a different, well, I should say, before I get to that, just simply that the heads of the families each received their share on behalf of their family, and they also signed receipts. And so then you had these down payments made at other posts as well, because under the RST, as you may recall, there's actually a stipulation that the payments of the monies would be made at Michipicoten and Fort William. That was a requirement under the treaties. And so these are 2 Hudson's Bay Company posts, and the officials there then were made responsible for this. Right from day one, even with the down payments, the HBC officials were doing this.
I'm going to ask a heretical question, I'm sure. In your second bullet point, you say that the representatives of Pic and Long Lake bands weren't there, they were more remote. Did they sign? Are they signatories? Pic and Long Lake?
They were
No.
they didn't have representatives there, as I recall. They had, but it was done through proxy.
Okay.
I don't recall the exact details, whether it was.
My question was just whether they were there and how all of a sudden they're lost. They're too remote.
Oh, no, they're not lost. They were never lost.
Or they're too remote
Yeah, no,
within days.
Anishinaabe peoples never get lost, so far as I know.
I misspoke.
Yeah, what they did do, Your Honor, is they were on their usual subsistence quest in their territories in the north, and were not available for their share at the time when Swanston showed up at Michipicoten with a bag of coins. However, that money was retained and they received it later.
Thank you.
Are you done with that? Anything you want to say about that slide, Doctor?
Yeah, just to add that overall, the policy was that in the event of absences, that the monies would be retained at the posts. for distribution whenever, often the following year. Like sometimes families wouldn't show up at these posts for months and months, and even a year would pass. Right, so this also happened with the down payment. As early as the down payment, it was that there were already absences. It was not an unusual circumstance. You know, these are very mobile societies who live off the land and don't linger too long in one place. Although they do frequent or did frequent these Hudson's Bay Company posts because that's where the trade goods were.
If you move then to the next slide, you get away from here, the $8,000, I'm just going to use dollars, down payment, and you talk about what you call the next treaty obligation. And is this now where you begin to explain your evidence around what you call, I think, the pre-augmented amount?
Yes.
All right, can you walk us through that, please?
So the next obligation, of course, was due the following year because the first annuity comes in 1851. And so the RST had £500 due. Now, originally, the deal was, £4,000, sorry, £2,000, but in total. And that, if you divided that, it would have been 1,000, sorry. The original amount would have amounted to 500 for the RST and 500 for the RHT, but there was a difference in population between the two. So that's why you've got 600 for the RHT instead. There was an addition made as a consequence of that disparity.
We're back to pounds now.
Yeah, so the £500 for the RST was the annual obligation, and the 600 for the RHT. So the total annual sum was always £1,100 per annum.
May I stop you very briefly just to ask you to clarify something that may make this record easier to read? Is there a relationship between the pounds and a reliable relationship between pounds and dollars, a ratio that one can keep in mind?
Yeah, it's times 4, right? So
How does that work?
well, a pound is $4.
Okay.
And so that's pretty simple, but where it starts getting complicated and where I had to develop some cheat sheets was when you start getting into the shillings and the pence, and because there's 12 shillings to, or there's 20 shillings to a pound and 12 pence to a shilling, and that gets a little complicated to convert that into our system that's based on
Okay,
tens.
forgive me for that. I just thought it might help in the back and forth. So go ahead with where you were, please.
So the proceeds that were derived from Robinson Treaty lands were not used and were never used to fund the annuities payable. So
What do you mean we're never used?
well, they just weren't used. I
Ever.
mean, they came out of CRF. Right? So, and in that sense, the Crown simply followed the precedent that had already been set with the earlier treaties. Because remember, the pre-1850 treaties were all funded by the CRF in their annual amounts. So in August of 1851, the Governor General put this question before the House of the provincial legislature and said basically, look, we need this £1,100. We got to pay this by August of 1851 to defray this new expense. And from this time onward, every year in the legislature, year after year after year, there was a vote. A vote to draw 1,100 pounds from the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the purposes of paying new Indian annuities. That was the term used, new Indian annuities. And that term was used to distinguish the new Indian annuities from the old ones. Remember that the old Indian annuities in the amount of 6,655 pounds was always drawn from the Consolidated Revenue Fund, but there was a statute in place, the civil list, which specified that had to happen. Whereas in the Robinson case, this was a new addition to that, which had not been stipulated in the 1846 statute. So it required a vote every year to add that amount.
But otherwise, there was no distinction.
No. In fact, ultimately, they were handled the same way. They were later capitalized at the same time. They were, it's basically the same thing. And of course, in the actual accounts, as I will show later, they were handled exactly the same way.
On the next slide, number 15, you mentioned an annual charge on the Canadian budget.
Yes.
What
Mr.
was-
Marcello,
yes.
I'm just getting a signal. This would be a good time for a break. Take 15.
All rise.
Dr. Von Granite, do you want some water up there, or do you
I
have
have
some?
something.
It's an occupational health hazard.
Pretty good?
Oh.
It's okay.
Oh, dear. Keep it down back there.
Before we get, can we go now? Or we're good? Before we get into slide 15, Doctor, I just want to clarify something on the fourth bullet on slide 14. It says in August of 1851, the Governor General laid before the houses of the provincial legislature. And this provincial legislature, what province are you talking about here? This is the UPC? and those-
Yes, it's the United Province, so it would include
Right,
Upper
right.
and Lower Canada.
Now we go to 15 here. And you begin talking about a permanent charge on the budget. And why don't you take us through these bullets? I think you may have skipped ahead through this already, if I recall, but let's just cover it.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is obviously an annual charge that was, again, predictable, just like the pre-1853s. And as such, it required a vote every year.
Mhm.
And it was always referred to as New Indian annuities. And remarkably, between 1851 and 1869, it continued to be referred to as New Indian annuities, even though they were no longer so new anymore. And that same amount was considered obligatory and at the same time predictable. And also distinguishable from that 6,655 payable under the pre-1850 treaties. So the bottom line here is that the Robinson treaties were handled in the exact same way as the pre-1850 treaties were, and hence were administered in the books the same way.
Now, on slide 16, you get back into this annuity funds versus land funds dichotomy.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, so what I wanted to turn to here are the actual books, because they're quite interesting and reflect this understanding. So as I said, the previous practice, and also one that was still existing at the time of the Robinson treaties in 1850 and continued after those treaties were signed, was to distinguish between annuity funds and land funds. So this 1,100 that the Receiver General received was split and then recorded in the books as two different dedicated annuity funds, the £500 or $2,000 for the RST and the rest for the RHT. And when we look at the books, which we will on the next slide, neither the RHT Anishinaabe or the RST Anishinaabe had a land fund. The same practice of crediting the First Nations, in this case, the Robinson First Nations, as had been done in previous years, continued. You know, they would they would debit amounts distributed under warrants, and then they would track the balances, and they all of this accounting really had to be done by the Receiver General, who had been placed in charge of this whole process of accounting.
Are we still pre-Confederation as you discussed this?
No, what I'm saying is that they just simply added the Robinson system to the existing one that was there already. And as you can see from the next slide, there's a page from the books. These are the Receiver General's books.
What Receiver General?
Well, this is the Receiver General for the entire province of Canada.
Sir, do you know, and you may not, whether there were any proceeds put in land funds that were from mining licenses?
No, I'm not aware of that. In fact, that would be highly unlikely, because the only real mining that was going on was in the Robinson territories.
And do you know if, from all of your other work, do you know if there were any proceeds put into land funds from timbering?
Well, I should qualify that by saying that the land funds that were generated from those other arrangements that I was talking about earlier, which involved like sales of reserve lands or leases, for example. So timber would be included in those funds. So for example, there were
Revenues from timbering.
revenues from timber on the reserves, right? So if for example, a First Nation had sold a portion of a reserve, revenues from timber or from land sales of some sort would all go into their land funds, right? Would not go into annuity funds.
But those were reserve based.
Yes. In terms of the annuity, the treaties that had annuities, those were not, there were no timber or mining or any proceeds from lands. They were all, everything was done through the CRF.
Right, but I know how, what it was done through, but I wondered if they had in their land funds,
In their land funds, yes,
in their land funds.
but not from
Revenue.
outside the reserves.
Okay. And nothing from mining,
Unless the mine was actually in the reserve.
or that you have ever come upon.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So on slide 17, this is difficult to read, and that's by no means your fault. This is no doubt it's a very old record. I think the reproduction in the slide might even be better than the one in the report. I wonder if can you explain to us what this shows us?
Yeah, so what you have here is on the left-hand side. So this is the portion of the Receiver General's books that relates to the Indian Department. And the date here is, I just selected this one because it was probably more legible than any of the others, but so this was on March 31st, 1853, when this was prepared. And so as of that time, you had listed on the left-hand side, again, the so-called tribes, who were the First Nations, who had various kinds of accounts that the Crown kept. And you'll notice that there's a column, well, some of them you recognize from the previous slide that I had that showed the 1851 printed Receiver General document.
Slide 7.
Yeah, you'll recognize some of them, like the Chippewas and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Moravians of the Thames, the Mohawks, the Saugeenes, and all, the usual ones are in there. And at the bottom now, added here in the left-hand column, you'll see Ojibwas of the Huron and Lake Superior, 2 different lines. Those are now the Robinson, the new annuities that are added to this existing list of various First Nations. And you'll notice to the right of that 2 entries. One of them is 600 pounds and the other one is 500 pounds. Immediately to the right of the yellow highlighted portion where it says Ojibwas of Lake Huron and Lake Superior. So they have a line each, indicating that the RHT is distinguished from the RST. And then if you track that across the same row, you'll see there's nothing until you reach a column under annuity fund, which I highlighted. On top, you'll see highlighted annuity fund and land fund. And so under annuity fund, you see what the Ojibwas of Lake Huron and Lake Superior had on hand. As you can see, it says on hand.
Mhm.
So that was an amount that was still left over from the previous payment. As I said, often the accounts did not balance to zero for various reasons, because amounts were, in the case of the RHT, that was more common because they were actually dispensing the funds not to individuals in the first few years, but rather to collectivities. Whereas in the RST, they were dispersing the funds to individuals, or I should say heads of families. And so in that case, you'd have the amount that the Hudson's Bay Company asked to be reimbursed with, obviously differed from year to year.
Mhm.
And so then you go to land funds and there's nothing. right? You'll notice that many of the other First Nations have something on hand in their land fund, but there is nothing there.
And to follow up then on my last question, would it best be described that the land funds including revenues derived from reserve-based sales, leases, timbering?
That's right. It didn't just, it wasn't included, it was rather the only thing that was in there.
The only thing.
Yes. Whereas their annuity is accounted for under the annuity fund columns. So they not only had, these other First Nations not only had on hand monies derived from their annuities, but also monies derived from whatever other arrangements they had on top of their treaty annuity monies.
Other arrangements
Yeah, so-
derived from their reserves.
Yes. Or sales of like islands or other small tracts of land.
Well, then as we go to the next slide, you make a point of differentiation in the first two bullets there. And then you talk again about individual bands having separate agreements and can you just elaborate on those first two
Yes.
bullets to begin with?
Yeah, so over time, there were individual bands belonging to the Robinson-Huron Treaty or Robinson-Superior Treaty, who in addition to their annuity funds, much like other First Nations, also had land funds. For instance, the reserve near Michipicotu was, these portions were relinquished at one point in time, and under an agreement that specified that they would get the proceeds from the lands in whatever proportion. I don't recall exactly what the stipulation was, but whatever that was, that would go into the land fund. And of course, you need an extra line now on the ledger because you can't include that under the Ojibwas of Lake Huron or Lake Superior. You know, I had to add another line to show that one First Nations within that group received more or extra or other funds from other sources. So for example, there are often, you know, after their sale of that reserve, there were references to, instead of a First Nation, it was Chief Tatame, who was the chief of the Michipicoten. And so he was the one listed as being the recipient or beneficiary on behalf of the band. So whatever amounts was entered on that line of the accountant.
If we move to slide 19 and 20, I would almost describe them as companion slides, but you're contrasting certain things regarding the RHT and the RST. And it may even go on to slide 21, but there's a definite contrast being made about how these obligations were discharged in respect of the two bands. Can you take us through these
Yes.
fairly carefully and eliminate that, please?
So as we know by now, the Robinson treaties the annuities were expressed as what I refer to as collective sums, in the sense that they're a single figure for the entire RST or RHT populations. And that made it easier, obviously, to allocate them for the common good, much like many of the earlier pre-1850 treaties had. But at the same time, there was nothing in the treaty language that would preclude paying individuals. And that, in fact, also happened. So the Indian Department recognized this one aspect of the Robinson treaties that was inviolable, really. It was not something that you could touch. They put their foot down and said, look, every person is entitled to their treaty money. And this question arose because there were some chiefs in the RHT territory who were complaining to the Crown that their allocations for their band had been based on their populations, and they should have been based on the size of the territory that they relinquished. And the Crown said, no, that's not the way it works. And of course, Vidal and Anderson had earlier warned against this. So Vidal and Anderson had said, look, if you're going to have a treaty, because at the time it was only supposed to be one treaty, if you're going to have a treaty, you make sure that everyone benefits, because the fact is that some First Nations up there don't have any mines in their territory. They don't have these resources that are potentially proceeds. And so the Crown, basically in response to this, said, the entitlement should not be based on the size of territories, but rather on the populations. And so in the case of the RST, as I said earlier, the annuities were all distributed to individual heads of families. But in the case of the RHT, in the early years, they were not distributed. There was only the down payment that was distributed to heads of families. The annuities were distributed into the annuity fund, and then from there, requisitions were made by chiefs and Indian agents to draw from them. And in the process, they made sure that because these were multiple bands, not only just one First Nation, but many, that each First Nation would get their allocations based on their populations. So that's how that worked. So what I'm saying on this particular slide is that what you had was this flexibility that the Crown believed was inherent in these treaties, and that the payments could be made in a variety of different ways. So long as the principle of each person still receiving their proportion, or each head of family receiving their proportion, was maintained. And so you had several different kinds of payments. You had allocations for the common good. You had disbursements to individuals in cash, and you also had commutations in goods, because the RHT for the first few years didn't actually get cash in hand.
All right, but those three possible ways of making those, fulfilling the obligation, you say was based on what was practical at the time?
Or what
Or
was
based
asked
on-
for. Right, the Crown, or I should say, the Indian Department had heard that the RST annuitants preferred cash monies to individual heads of families. At the same time, they heard that the preference among the RHT was to have the old system that was used down south, and that is allocations for the common good in the form of useful articles that they would specify and requisition on their annuity accounts. That later changed to cash payments to individual heads of families, but in the early years, it was in the form of articles. I give you an example in my report on that. I could probably find the page number.
You refer to the Crown taking a hard line in response to a request that the annuities be proportioned or distributed in proportion to size of territory as opposed to population.
Yes,
As I recall the evidence from stage one, there was one petition in that respect.
there was.
Was there anything more?
I don't recall if there was any more, but what happened to the petition was that I think it was Bruce was in charge at the time. He immediately contacted Robinson, who was
Right,
still
he shut it
alive.
down.
Yeah, Robinson then, the correspondence is a little unclear, but Robinson's the impression that Robinson gave to Bruce was that he had treated this as all the previous treaties, and this had been explained to them at the time of treaty. And Bruce took that to mean that, the deal was not that the proceeds would be distributed according to the sizes of the tracts that each First Nation ceded.
Thank you.
Yeah, you move on slide 20 to discussion of the RST annuity.
Yes. Yeah, so as I said earlier, the RHT version, at least, starting in 1851 and going at least for a few years, it's not entirely clear, and I don't recall when it stopped, but in the early years, it was for allocations to the common good. And each band would receive its share according to its band numbers. And so once that was established and the money went into or was allocated for that band, they would then requisition useful items for their own use. And that's no different from what had been the practice in the pre-1850 treaties, right? So, and eventually, as I said, that was replaced with cash distributions to heads of families. But in the RST case, right from the beginning, it was always cash payments to heads of families, right from day one in 1851. So this would ensure that, I mean, the upside for that, of course, is that the beneficiaries would receive their equal shares, and they could, make their own personal decisions about how to spend it. And because there were, for a variety of reasons, which I outline at great length in my report, the individual shares would vary from year to year, wasn't always the same amount. And on this slide, slide 20, there is a sort of highlight a portion of one of these pay lists. Again, there's no real reason for this one as opposed to any other, except that's probably the clearest that I found in the archival record. And what you have here is from the Nipigon band. So Nipigon, as you know, is much more remote than Fort William. It's literally a 6-day journey back then to get from Fort William to Lake Nipigon. But this particular pay list was not done at Lake Nipigon. It was done at Fort Francis, sorry, at Fort William. And it's the pay list for all of the individuals that happen to show up at that fort at that date, as opposed to being a comprehensive list of every Nipigon band member. And when you look at it and do the math, which I did for you on this slide, you'll see that each individual here is entitled to $1.75, which is the conversion from 8 shillings and 9 pence. And the way I arrived at that is through the calculation that I gave. Manitoussaint, which is spelled differently here, you will recall, was the treaty signatory to the RST, who was a chief of the Lake Nipigon band. And so he and his colleague were at the fort on this day, receiving their proportions. And of course, their signatures, as usual, are given with an X. And then there's a name of the witness. And the name of the witness in this case is Jean-Pierre, I believe, Chaunet, who was the local Jesuit priest. And Francis Ermatinger that you see there. So this is a pre-printed thing. This was done back at the Indian Department, a pre-printed form, which then was sent to the Hudson's Bay Company people who were in charge of administering these annuity payments. And Francis Ermatinger was the local, he had filled in for the usual guide, which is why he's an unusual name. You don't encounter him very often. And this was done at the behest of the Indian Department, who set the regulations to be used by the Hudson's Bay Company in administering it. They were asked to get these receipts and to ensure that there were witnesses. In some cases, there was no, the original instructions were to get the local missionary as a witness, because back in those days, not so much today, back in those days, they were considered to be sort of the you know, an authority that cannot be questioned. But that wasn't always practical. So at Michipicoten, for example, they had to replace that provision with one that allowed a Hudson's Bay Company official to be the witness. So that's how these records were maintained. And they became very complicated because not only were there these records, but there are also individual records at each post, which I examined in some detail and described in my report.
Can we turn to the pre-1851 role of the Hudson's Bay Company? I think you addressed that on the next slide.
Yeah, so this just explains how the Hudson's Bay Company ended up with this role. I mean, I don't have to get into detail, but in short, what happened was Governor Simpson, who was the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, had suggested to the Crown very early on that his company, a huge private company, which had great, lengthy experience, over a century of experience with dealing with indigenous peoples at these posts, that the government might consider that they would administer this.
A private company with a century of retail experience.
Yes,
Who knew a
exactly.
pool of customers.
Exactly, and I made that point. That's exactly, because it always puzzled me, why the hell is this guy, suddenly saying, oh, we'll do this free of charge, right?
Whereas the Crown would charge the fees for someone to come up and pay.
yes,
This was a great offer.
absolutely. So the Crown agreed, and Simpson reckoned that, here comes a cash flow suddenly every year, right to our posts. And that's where they spend the money,
Circular economy.
absolutely.
What'd they spend the money on?
Well, the trade goods that were useful to the Anishinaabe, right? I mean, they're out hunting and gathering, they need, parts for guns, they need snares, they need provisions, that's what the Hudson's Bay Company posts were there. They're designed for the trade. The beaver would come in and the goods would go out.
Can you carry on, or is there more you want to say, or no more you want to say about the HBC?
No, except that, the one thing about this process, which is quite impressive, I mean, laying aside the pecuniary interests that the HBC had in all of this, they did actually a reasonable job at this. They did keep records, and those records are still extant. And the governor was adamant that his employees make sure that every penny was accounted for. And, the governor always made sure that the posts had enough money to pay for these annuities, because these were not paid in advance. The governor of the HBC had to send a letter to the Crown every year asking for reimbursement. So in any event, by all accounts, not just from my assessment of these records, but also by others who later commented on them, they didn't really screw up. But what they did accomplish was actually quite remarkable, considering the incredible difficulties involved in this, which I just described in considerable detail. This is not an easy task. It's one of these things where you think again, hey, come on, this should be easy. The Anishinaabe show up, you pay them whatever the amount is, and that's it. And then no, that's not how it worked. It was incredibly complex. There were so many problems. And so.
Well, I'm sorry, on your next slide, you mentioned that.
Yes.
In the last bullet, you talk about many problems and solutions. Are you able to recall what some of those were? Is this one of the things you talked about, entitlement, earlier today? Is that one of them?
Yeah, so there were issues of entitlement, which is, of course, was nothing new in this instance. For instance, there were individuals or groups from outside of the RST territory who lived to the west or beyond the Haida land, who claimed that that their traditional lands included the RST territories, and who also wanted some of the annuities. And so in the very early years, there was also a debate about whether they would be included or excluded, and what did the chief say about this, and so forth. It's not an easy thing at all, the entitlement issue. I remember seeing records of two brothers, one being on one side of the Haida land as his hunting territory, and another being on the other side. One ended up as an RST annuitant, and the other ended up in Treaty 9 territory. So, I mean, the Haida land was a political boundary, not so much a cultural boundary. And so this created some problems. Then there was the issue of the so-called half-breeds, rather today would be a derogatory term for an individual of mixed heritage. Robinson had suggested early on that it really didn't matter whether they were included or not, because once the annuity was established as a yearly annual fixed amount, it was up to the chiefs to determine how many or how few to include. So he didn't think it was that much of a problem. However, it did become a problem because some of them showed up on census, on HBC census figures, and others didn't. And so that was another issue. Yet another issue is related to the mobility of these bands. And as I said, these are primarily hunter-gatherers who have a foraging mode of subsistence that takes them on a seasonal round through vast territories, and they're not always to be found, and they don't always show up at the posts. And so what do you do with them? How do you pay them, the individual families? And so sometimes you have to retain amounts and hope they'll show up the following year. And what do you do with the money? Do you send it back? Do you retain it at the post? What do you do with it? So the records became very complicated. And so the annuities from year to year were also very complicated. In some years they received very large amounts because there were amounts accumulated in the annuity fund which had to be distributed. And so decisions had to be made as to how to distribute those. So there's all these practical impediments and challenges. And, to their credit, they try to overcome them with common sense and some form of accommodations. But it wasn't easy, and I think it's still a very messy affair. Trying to reconstruct it today is still very difficult.
Thank you, Dr. Von Gernert. Your Honor, do you have any questions on this chapter before we move on to the next one?
No, thank you.
Now, you talked about tracking already to an extent. We're going into chapter 3, which is entitled Tracking Proceeds from the Lands. And there's much detail about compiling data and so on. Can we begin with slide 23 and take us through the data compilation process in the 1850s, if you would?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, the pre-augmented annuities came from a grant, and they referred to it as a grant. That's why I have it in quotation marks, from the CRF. And so the actual income from the lands became irrelevant to paying the pre-augmented annuities. They were fixed by treaty, and that total amount had to be paid no matter what. If the lands produced nothing, the Crown still had to pay that amount. So there was no, that was a solemn treaty obligation, much like that $26,000 for the earlier treaty obligations. This had to be paid every year. But if there still remained, no matter how you read it, there still remained a need to track proceeds from the surrendered territories, whether you're using them to pay the annuities or not, because there is that augmentation clause there.
And you have a couple of scenarios in the last few bullets on this slide 23.
Yeah, so if the clause was taken to mean that the increase would be paid from the future net proceeds, then tracking the income and costs was a prerequisite to funding the augmented amounts. Even if the increases were not funded by the proceeds, and that's what actually happened, tracking income and costs was necessary for the purpose of ascertaining whether or when the condition by which the annuities could be increased had been met.
A comment, I think there was a double negative in the witness's testimony, and it's not going to benefit anyone for confusion. When the witness says that the increases were not funded by the proceeds as they actually happened, does the actually happened mean not funded by the proceeds or were funded by the proceeds? Confusion is not going to help, and I think we should clear it up.
I think you addressed that earlier, but clear it
Did you-
up.
Sorry, did you,
Yeah.
in something that was just said?
Yeah,
Okay,
the witness just said it, and it's just a double negative.
okay,
And I
Right.
believe that what the witness said could be taken in two different ways. The subclause "as actually happened" could either refer to were not funded by the proceeds or were funded by the proceeds. It's a grammatical unhappy choice of words, and it's deserving of clarity.
okay, let me please go to it.
It's in slide 23.
Just the last bullet on 23, the phrase in brackets, I think is what my
Oh,
friend.
as actually happened.
Yeah, I think you're,
Can you take a look at it, please?
Yes, I did. I don't see any issue with it. It's not a double negative.
Okay, what do you say it means?
Even if the increases were not funded by the proceeds, as actually happened, they were not funded from the proceeds. So it's not a double negative. As actually happened, they were not funded from the proceeds. I mean, it's pretty clear in my view.
so
Well, let me see if I understand it. You say, even if the increases were not sourced, even if the increases paid by the Crown or contemplated to be paid by the Crown were not to be funded by the proceeds.
Yes, as was actually the case.
Well, when were what increases are you talking about?
The augmented annuities as of 1875.
The single augmentation.
Yes.
I have a question. What actually happened?
Well, it actually happened that the difference between the pre-augmented annuities and the augmented annuities were funded by the CRF and not by the proceeds of the land.
Thank you.
And Mr. Schachter, are you clear now what the witness is saying?
Yeah, I'm clear now. I think the witness has cleared it up. I thought it was unhappily worded, and perhaps
Okay.
if I was wrong, I apologize, but
Well, it's helpful for me just to know that we're talking about the single increase in 1875. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Now, the next slide is quite short. I would like you to perhaps expand a little, if you could, on the second bullet. You can by all means take us through the first one, but I would ask you to maybe expand a little bit on the second one.
Yeah, so the first bullet point simply refers to the fact that the government, in fact, did track revenues and expenditures as part of its accounting process. That's unsurprising. Of course, they did that. However, with few exceptions, it didn't do so specifically with the Robinson Treaty augmentation clause in mind. And so we do have an indisputable example of that in 1857. And of course, the later examples I talk about to a great extent. You know, once they did it in 1874 and again in 1879, the latter being the most extensive. But the record also hints of occasional audits that confirm, I mean, they didn't really do anything else but confirm that the conditions of the augmentation clause had not yet been met. And we don't have any records of that actually happening, we only have hints of it happening. When Sprague in 1873 said that, you know, until relatively recent times, it's always, we were always led to believe that the proceeds had not arrived at an amount that would allow the government to increase the augment the annuities. So
Can I just ask you one question? You said it did not happen, it being an audit? You say, we don't have any records of that actually happening? Being
Yeah.
audits?
yeah, with the exception of 1857 and then the ones in the 1870s. All we have are hints that this did happen from time to time, because otherwise Sprague wouldn't have made an allusion to it. Because as late as 1873, he was saying that until recently, or until recent times, he had always been led to believe that the income from the lands had not been sufficient yet. So somebody must have given him that understanding. So, I mean, this is one of the areas where I think certainly the government could have done a hell of a lot better. You know, this is not because they had to do it anyway, and they eventually did. But it was so tedious to reconstruct later on that it would have been easier if had they done it earlier on a more consistent basis and a more transparent basis. But I deal with all of that a little later. So this is just a sort of a preview of what's to come.
On slide 25, now you begin an orientation in your evidence somewhat toward mining in particular, and the need for surveying in conjunction with mining. Is that, am I taking that correctly? From your evidence here?
Yeah, so the first thing that had to happen was after the treaty was signed, there was, of course, an amount that already was extant at the time of treaty for mining proceeds. And it was the title of one of my reports in stage one. You know, there's a number of, there's already some monies available from mining, but it was very modest. So they have been keeping track already of proceeds prior to the treaty. And there is a document extant that shows what those proceeds were, which I discuss in my report. They continue to do that over the course of time. But in order to get land sales in general, because keep in mind, the government never had revenues from royalties from mining or any kind of mining proceeds per se. What they did have was the income from issuing mining licenses, which was a very small amount, and from the first or second installments of the payments that mining companies were supposed to make on the sale of the lands themselves. So in order to do any kind of land sales, you need to survey. And this whole territory had never been surveyed prior to the 1850s, with the exception of the few mining locations which were extant at the time of treaty.
Right.
And so the Crown Lands Department proposed that the lands would be organized. And by organized, they meant in those days, you survey baselines, which are just straight lines through the forest. And then off of those lines, you do perpendicular lines and then start creating blocks. And then those blocks would be subdivided into smaller blocks until you end up with saleable lots. Right. So that was what was meant by organizing the land. And so that process only got underway at about the time when the first annuities were being paid, 1851. Surveying was also important because you needed to know the metes and bounds of reserves. The treaties had indicated sort of a rough place where these reserves were to be established, but nobody knew on the ground exactly where these reserves were. And so surveyors had to be commissioned to go out and survey those, and that took years. I mean, that's, for the life of me, I don't understand why it took so long, but that took a long time to get these reserves surveyed. And the importance here is that you needed to know relative to proceeds, you needed to know, which proceeds came from within reserves and which came outside reserves. You don't know that unless you know where the lines are.
Right.
So that was an important prerequisite. Now, given that this region did not attract many settlers, very, very few, it had originally been contemplated that mining would in fact be the primary source of revenue. In fact, as I testified at great length in stage one, where I talked about mining for days, mining, was the raison d'etre of the entire Robinson treaties. That's what really set the ball in motion. The reason why we had the treaties at the time we had them is because of mining. So mining was really what was driving things. And yet the mining resources were incredibly modest because of the mining regulations at the time, which provided for no royalties. And of course, many of these mining companies actually failed.
Well,
So-
I'm sorry,
No, go ahead.
the regulatory system respecting mining appears to have made several pivots. And
Yes, that would be the next slide.
why, yeah, so why don't we go through that and take us down on the ground at that time and tell us
Is
what,
Is this a good time to break for the day?
sure, if that's whatever everyone
I
wants.
see it's 4:40. Okay.
10
So
o'clock.
let's do that. How are you, sir, on your plan for day one?
My plan for day one is good. It's,
Okay,
I'm not behind.
okay, good.
Um,
Let's do that.
I wonder if my friend could, when he says day one was supposed to be yesterday,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and he was going to be meeting the whole week. And I'm wondering, am I going to be preparing for cross-examination for Friday, or I'm wondering how well he's going.
Does it matter how much I interrupt? Or- You want me to be part of this conversation?
I think if you have questions, you should be asking them, but I turn to my friend just for some
Sure.
guidance on the subject.
I actually should have asked that early on. Maybe we'll close for the day. All right, we'll go off